Hi, welcome to my restoration studio. Today we're going to be talking just about some things that we're going to be doing in Arts in Bloom on the 20th or 21st of May in Woodstown at site number 22 from Gregg Perry. I'm a classically trained gilder in Paris and in Venice, Italy. I'm just going to go over this briefly. You'll be seeing some gilding and some very important gilded objects, a few French frames and a few Venetian frames, period frames from the 18th century I'll have on display at the old Red House in Woodstown. Briefly, I'm going to talk about the process of gilding. Gilding is a surface finish. I mean, if you can imagine paint or stain or even a clear finish. Just another type of finish is putting gold on instead of paint, for instance. So it's a surface, it's a covering of wood or a substrate of some sort, okay? And in this case, we're actually covering wood, but generally the wood is encased in water gilding in a gesso, which is nothing more than calcium carbonate, or as a more generic term would be plaster of Paris. So let's go over, this is a frame that when I was teaching courses, I'd use this as a frame for students. In a 40-hour week, we would physically build this frame, make the molding, miter it, put sliding dovetails, tapered sliding dovetails. We used old wood in this case, and do the entire gilding process. So that would take about 40 hours. But keep in mind, everyone was novice, and it was a lot of preparation to get to this point. So in general, everything of the gilding process is done with a glue. It's rabbit skin glue. Rabbit skin glue has a great tensile strength, but it's very flexible in the same token. So we mix the rabbit skin glue with calcium carbonate to form gesso. We mix it with our clay, our bowls, the whole process, even the gilding liquor, okay? So we start out by getting dry calcium carbonate. And again, I will have this laid out with a lot more room in the Arts in Bloom weekend. But we take calcium carbonate and mix it with rabbit skin glue, and we take a stippling brush from our gilding rack here, and we literally stipple about 10 to 12 coats. It must be put on warm. It's a chemical and a mechanical drying bond. And you stipple about 10, 15, 20 coats until you get to the thickness that all of the wood is covered. At that point, when we move down to the second half of the frame, we start sanding or braiding it down. In the period, they would use shark and stingray skins. There were actually shark and stingray boutiques in Philadelphia, Paris, Milano, London, where all the gilders were located. And you get this to the equivalent of about 600 grit sandpaper. Remember, a young stingray or shark would have very fine skin, a very fine abrasive, and the old cranky ones, 8, 10 years old, would have very rough. So you would start with different gradations, and that's how you would buy the skins to use instead of sandpaper. But today I'm using wet dry sandpaper, and it seems to work very well. So once we have drying time for about 4 or 5 days, you will braid it down, super smooth, feels almost like metal if you weren't looking at it. And we come over here. Typically the clays are used when you have sculpting, such as the beading effect, which I did not carve down here. But this, I'm using an ochre clay from France, and what that does is that yellow color will get on to the gesso and into the nooks and crannies. So if I don't get gold into every nook and cranny, when you look at it from a distance with limited light, as in the 18th century, what it's going to look like is it's all gold. So if you have some misses, they call them holidays here in America, if you have some misses, then you won't notice it that relevantly, okay? And on high spots, just like the top of the beads, you tend just to put the red clay on the top of the beads. And what it does, it just sends a nice softer hue through the gold, because the gold is so thin it's transparent. It's a quarter the thickness of a human hair. So here we're mixing these clays in 2 different applications, one day, one the next. Do the entire frame with it. And you must, again, you're mixing with rabbit skin glue and water, and it must be kept at about 104 to 110 degrees. If you go over that, you're actually going to destroy the collagen in the rabbit skin glue. And once our clay is in the profession we call it bowl, just a side note is these clays are totally specific to countries. So, and you may have 3 or 4 shades. So In Provence in France, you have a certain type of yellow ochre. In Paris and other regions of Italy, in Japan today, in Germany, and the reds, you have the same. So if this is an antique dealer is trying to sell you an Italian frame and you see a little bit of this color red, he's blowing smoke. This is French. So if you're really astute on your gilding and you can see a little bit of the bowl, the color, you know what country it came from or what region of what country it came from. Nevertheless, we let this dry for about 3 or 4 days, and we're ready to actually apply our gilding, our gold leaf. Okay, so the gold leaf, we have to remember that the bowl is impregnated, part of it, the sticking capability of the clay is with the rabbit skin glue. So it's dry here, so under here is the clay. So we create, it's called a gilding liqueur. We're using water, a little bit of alcohol, and rabbit skin glue. And what we do is we just take our brush, our mop, we call it a mop this time, and that's what we did here. We literally wet the surface of the bowl with this slight adhesive. We're adding a little adhesive, but we're also, with the water, reactivating the present adhesive inside of the bowl clay. And then, so once our clay has been hydrated and wet, we're going to go over to, this is our gilder's cushion. So we get our fingers locked in. We have a gilding knife, very specific, 2 sharp edges. And today, what we're working on in the shop, we don't have any gild, but we're actually doing some palladian gilding. Gilding can come in palladium and copper and other type of metals. So literally, I'm going to blow a piece of palladium onto my gilders, onto my mat. And part of the process of learning how to be a gilder is to manipulate the gold. And before you even attempt to put the gold down on our wetted area, you need to be able to flatten the gold out like that. And simply, I ripped it coming out, unfortunately, but you would empty, this is called a book. There's 25 leaves in here of 3 3/8 by 3 3/8. And just imagine this is gilt, but this is actually palladium. I dump all the leaves in the back of my gilder's pad. This is if there's any air movement that the gold doesn't blow out. Right now, gold is about $75 to $100 per book. And this is the size of the book. So my knife, I put one pressure down, I pull back, and you cut it. So you end up cutting the palladium like this, okay? And that's the piece. And you would put small pieces down. And typically, this is your gilder's tip or brush to apply the gold leaf or this type palladium. You would have some kind of pig's lard or something like that. You could touch the pig's lard, say on your wrist, and go and pick the piece up. And sometimes we have oil on our skin, and we can pick it up like that. And this is made out of very select squirrel tail, only French or Italian squirrel tail, very specific squirrels, okay? And, but for the sake, we're not actually doing the gilding today, and we'll be demonstrating this in our weekend. But just imagine this was all clay and it's wet, and I literally come and I lay my piece of gold or palladium down, and it sticks. So when I'm done, I have an entire run that's gilded, freshly gilded. Now, you have a time period. What happens is that the moisture that we put on here tends to suck the gold as it's going into the clay and rehydrating. It literally sucks the gold down, and in sucking the gold down in the rehydration process, the surface is tacky, so it sucks it into a tacky place and it makes it adhere. Even around the beads up here, it just like sucks it right down. So it's a great process. And this should sit for about 4 or 5 hours, and we have to determine whether we're going to burnish it. And burnishing is making the high spots highly polished. And when we burnish, we use a dog's tooth agate. And I'm not going to bring this guy, let's see, we may have one right here. Here's the agate, a stone, which is very rare today, super, super smooth, different shapes and sizes just for gilders. And then I simply, within 3 to 4 hours after gilding, I go back and forth in just these high areas, and I put a burnish or shine on it. So I'm creating a contrast of the high point of the beads and the background of the gilding. So continuing along with our gilding project. So after this is dried for about overnight, say, we want to be able to put a patina on, okay? So in order to put a patina on, this is a very smooth surface, our newly gilded surface. So at least in the French manner, in the French tradition, what they're going to use is gelatin, actually just a food-grade gelatin. You mix it up, you get it just so it dissolves, add a little heat on a double boiler, Do not overcook it, otherwise you're going to lose all its adhesive properties. And again, you're going to take another kind of mop, and you're going to brush the gelatin over the entire gilded surface, okay? And what happens is when this dries, it forms micro fissures that can only be seen under a microscope. It preserves the gold surface, but number two, it creates these very tiny fissures that what we're going to do now is come over with painting pigments, and we're trying to get an age or artificial patina here. And a lot of times I'm not gilding a new object. I'm trying to make this side of the frame match the rest because perhaps this was damaged. Somebody dropped it, dropped something on it. So I'm putting gelatin down to create a very fine matrix which we can't see with our eye. And then I'm taking painting pigments and literally painting over this whole surface and dabbing it off with a cotton ball to take off. I can leave as much on or take off as much as I like to get the desired type patina. And remember, with looking glasses such as this, and this is a looking glass, environmental contaminants of the 18th century and the fires and smoke inside, they would all land on this bottom section. The top would be relatively clean and the sides just a little bit dirtier, but all the dirt and grime would be here and on top of the looking glass, okay? And hence you have a finished patinized section there of a looking glass. That's a nice little project. These are skewings. These are pieces of gold that in some of my projects fall on the floor, and you don't want to waste them. You tend to pick it up, and you can make some repairs and fixes with this gold. Okay, so you don't want to let that. Probably in here we have, I don't know, $300, $400, $500 worth of gold. Okay, and just a quick look here. This was a class project in Paris, and this was a project on patinizations. So we were to go around on some of the famous ports or doors of Paris, which you have a poster over here, and we were to find an ornament in there and cast it, make a clay mold, on site, mix up some plaster of Paris, and make these out of plaster of Paris. And then come back and put different kinds of patinas, and you can see the contrast here of the bright and the matte. These are different patinas using different techniques of smoke and various painting pigments, okay? And that's about it. But thanks again, and come see us on May 20th and 21st, and number 22 in Woodstown. Thank you so much for listening.